What happens when brilliance meets bias in a prestigious school's classroom? Meet Marcus, a 13-year-old mathematical genius whose torn clothes hide an extraordinary mind, and Ms. Bennet, a teacher whose prejudices blind her to the remarkable student before her. As their daily classroom battles intensify, an impossible challenge emerges that will change everything. Dear viewer, this heartwarming story of triumph over prejudice will leave you speechless. So, I humbly request you please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, press the bell icon for more inspiring stories that challenge our perceptions and warm our hearts. Thank you. Let's dive into the full story. Marcus Johnson stood at the entrance of Riverside Academy, his worn backpack clutched tightly against his chest. The prestigious school's imposing brick facade loomed before him, its manicured lawns and gleaming windows a stark contrast to his previous public school. His mother had worked 3 jobs to move them to this district, determined to give her son the education he deserved. Taking a deep breath, Marcus pushed open the heavy oak doors. The hallways buzzed with activity as students rushed to their first classes. His schedule indicated room 204, Advanced Mathematics with Ms. Catherine Bennet. Finding the room, he hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. Ms. Bennet, a tall blonde woman in her early 30s, was writing equations on the whiteboard. She turned at the sound of the door, her blue eyes narrowing slightly as they fell on Marcus. "You must be the new student," she said, her voice carrying a hint of skepticism. "Take a seat." Marcus found an empty desk near the front, aware of the curious glances from his classmates. His clothes, though clean and pressed, were visibly worn, a fact not lost on Ms. Bennet, who seemed to be studying him with barely concealed disdain. "As I was saying," she continued, "today we'll be discussing advanced algebraic expressions. I don't expect everyone to grasp this immediately." Her gaze lingered on Marcus. "Especially those who might not have had adequate preparation." The class proceeded, with Ms. Bennet explaining increasingly complex problems. She wrote a particularly challenging equation on the board. "Would anyone like to solve this? Perhaps someone who's been with us since the beginning of the year." Several hands went up, but Ms. Bennet's attention was drawn to Marcus, who sat quietly with his hand down, scribbling in his notebook. "Mr. Johnson," she called out, a slight smirk playing at her lips. "Since you seem occupied with something else, perhaps you'd like to show us what you know." Marcus looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers steadily. Without a word, he rose and walked to the board. The classroom fell silent as he picked up the marker. His hand moved swiftly, confidently, breaking down the equation step by step. When he finished, he placed the marker down and returned to his seat. Ms. Bennet stared at the board, her lips pressed into a thin line. The solution was perfect, each step meticulously explained. "Well," she said after a moment, "it seems you've memorized this particular problem type. Let's try something more challenging." She wrote another equation, this one far more complex than the first. Again, Marcus solved it flawlessly, adding additional notes about alternative solution methods. The class watched in amazement as their new classmate demonstrated a mathematical understanding that surpassed even their teacher's expectations. By the end of class, Ms. Bennet's initial skepticism had transformed into barely concealed irritation. As the students filed out, she called Marcus back. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice tight. "While I appreciate enthusiasm, showing off is not welcome in my classroom. You would do well to remember that." Marcus nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am. I just answered the questions you asked." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "And Mr. Johnson? Tomorrow, try to wear something more appropriate for our school environment." Marcus felt the sting of her words but kept his expression neutral. Walking out, he thought of his mother, who had stayed up late ironing this very shirt, making sure he looked his best for his first day. He wouldn't let Ms. Bennet's prejudice diminish his mother's sacrifices or his own abilities. That evening, as Marcus sat at their small kitchen table doing homework, his mother returned from her second job. Despite her exhaustion, she smiled warmly. "How was your first day, baby?" Marcus considered telling her about Ms. Bennet but decided against it. "It was fine, Mom. The math is interesting. She touched his shoulder gently. You show them what you can do, Marcus. Your father always said knowledge is something nobody can take from you. Marcus nodded, thinking of the father he'd lost 2 years ago. His dad had been a self-taught mathematician, sharing his passion with Marcus through countless evening lessons before illness took him too soon. Now, each equation Marcus solved was a tribute to his father's memory. The following weeks at Riverside Academy proved to be a complex equation in themselves, one that Marcus solved with quiet determination. Ms. Bennett's class became a daily exercise in restraint as she consistently sought ways to expose what she presumed would be his intellectual limitations. One morning, she devoted the class to an obscure branch of number theory, something well beyond the standard curriculum. Today, she announced with a satisfied smile, we'll explore the Riemann hypothesis and its implications for prime number distribution. The class stirred uncomfortably, but Marcus sat up straighter. His father had spent countless evenings discussing this very topic with him, explaining its beauty and mystery with the same enthusiasm others might use to describe a favorite movie. Mr. Johnson, Ms. Bennett called out, since you seem so eager to display your knowledge, perhaps you can explain to the class why the Riemann hypothesis matters. The class held its collective breath. This was university-level mathematics, far beyond what any of them had studied. But Marcus stood, his voice clear and confident. The Riemann hypothesis is one of the most important unsolved problems in mathematics, he began. It makes a prediction about the distribution of prime numbers, suggesting they follow a pattern related to something called the zeta function. If proven, it would help us understand the fundamental nature of prime numbers. Ms. Bennett's smile faltered as Marcus continued, drawing diagrams on the board and explaining complex concepts in terms his classmates could understand. By the end of his explanation, several students were nodding with newfound comprehension. That's sufficient, Ms. Bennett interrupted, her voice sharp. Though I notice you didn't mention the critical strip or the functional equation. Actually, Marcus replied respectfully, I was building to that. The critical strip is crucial because. He proceeded to explain these concepts too, adding details that even Ms. Bennett hadn't expected him to know. The pattern continued across other subjects. In literature, when Ms. Bennett assigned a complex analysis of Shakespeare's Othello, she called on Marcus first, clearly expecting him to struggle with the classical text. Instead, he delivered a nuanced interpretation that connected the play's themes of prejudice and preconception to contemporary social issues. His analysis was so compelling that other students began adding their own insights, turning the class into a lively discussion that Ms. Bennett struggled to control. During a particularly memorable chemistry class, Ms. Bennett set up a demonstration that went slightly wrong. While she fumbled with the equipment, Marcus quietly pointed out that the reaction wouldn't work because the solution's pH was incorrect. His intervention prevented what could have been a minor accident, but Ms. Bennett seemed more irritated by his help than grateful. The other teachers began to notice Marcus's exceptional abilities. Mr. Rodriguez, the Spanish teacher, was delighted to discover Marcus's fluency, gained from spending time with his father's Puerto Rican colleagues. The music teacher found him practicing complex jazz progressions during lunch, another gift from his father's diverse interests. But Ms. Bennett's resistance to Marcus's abilities only grew stronger. She began marking his tests with unprecedented scrutiny, searching for any minor errors she could find. When she couldn't find mistakes, she questioned whether he was cheating, though she had no evidence to support such accusations. One day, after Marcus had perfectly solved another impossible problem, she kept him after class again. Mr. Johnson, she said, her voice cold, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I've taught at this school for 8 years. I know what excellence looks like, and it doesn't come from. She caught herself, but Marcus understood the unspoken end of her sentence. From someone like me, he asked quietly. From students who haven't had the proper background, she amended, though they both knew what she meant. Perhaps if you spent less time showing off and more time on your appearance, you'd better represent what Riverside Academy stands for. Marcus looked down at his clothes, clean but obviously worn. His mother had promised new ones soon, once she got her next paycheck. But he stood tall, remembering his father's words, your mind is your finest outfit, son. Never let anyone make you ashamed of who you are. As he left the classroom, Marcus heard Ms. Bennet on the phone with someone, her voice carrying into the hallway. "Yes, I need to schedule a meeting with Principal Green. It's about Marcus Johnson. We need to discuss his suitability for our program." Marcus clutched his books tighter, knowing that bigger challenges lay ahead. But like every complex problem he'd ever faced, he would solve this one too, step by step, with dignity and determination. The autumn leaves were falling outside Riverside Academy when Ms. Bennet announced their next unit. "Today, we're starting our section on European history and its influence on modern mathematics and science." Marcus sat quietly, noticing how Ms. Bennet's eyes lingered on him with a hint of challenge. She pulled up a presentation filled with images of European mathematicians and scientists, deliberately skipping over any mentions of contributions from other cultures. "The foundations of modern mathematics," she declared, "were primarily established in Europe during the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods. Can anyone name some key figures?" Several hands shot up, listing familiar names: Newton, Euler, Gauss. Ms. Bennet nodded approvingly until Marcus raised his hand. "Yes, Mr. Johnson." Her tone carried its usual edge of skepticism. While European mathematicians made significant contributions, Marcus began carefully. Many fundamental concepts originated in Africa and the Middle East. The ancient Egyptians developed advanced geometry for architecture, and scholars at Timbuktu's universities were solving complex equations centuries before the European Renaissance. The class fell silent. Ms. Bennet's smile tightened. "We're focusing on European contributions, Mr. Johnson. Perhaps you're in the wrong classroom if you want to discuss other topics." But Marcus continued respectfully. "Actually, Ms. Bennet, many European developments were built on African and Middle Eastern foundations. The algebra we use today comes from Al-Khwarizmi's work. Even the word algebra comes from the Arabic al-jabr." A student named Sarah raised her hand. "Is that true? We never learned about that." Before Ms. Bennet could intervene, Marcus elaborated. "Yes, and the Egyptian mathematician Ames wrote one of the first mathematical textbooks around 1650 BC. The Rhine papyrus shows they understood concepts that wouldn't be discovered in Europe for thousands of years." Ms. Bennet's face flushed. "Mr. Johnson, this is not a platform for your personal agenda." "It's not an agenda, Ms. Bennet," Marcus replied quietly. "It's history. My father taught me that understanding where knowledge comes from helps us appreciate how all cultures contribute to human progress." The class had become entirely engaged, with students asking questions about these lesser-known contributions to mathematics. Even James, usually half asleep in the back row, was taking notes. Ms. Bennet attempted to redirect the discussion, but the damage was done. Her carefully constructed narrative of exclusive European intellectual superiority had been challenged with facts she couldn't dispute. "Perhaps," she said coldly, "we should have a quiz on European contributions tomorrow. I expect everyone to focus on the assigned material, not alternative histories." The threat was clear, but Marcus spent that evening studying both European and non-European mathematical developments. His mother found him surrounded by library books late into the night. "Baby, you should get some sleep," she said, worried about the dark circles under his eyes. "I have to know everything, Mom," he replied. "She's waiting for me to fail." His mother sat beside him, her work uniform still on. "You remind me so much of your father. He never let anyone tell him what he couldn't learn or couldn't achieve." She touched one of the books. "He'd be so proud of how you're standing up for the truth." The next day, Ms. Bennet's quiz was brutally specific, focused on obscure European mathematicians and dates. But Marcus completed it with perfect accuracy, adding relevant connections to concurrent developments in other parts of the world in the extra credit section. When she returned the quizzes, his detailed answers had earned him another perfect score she couldn't deny. But her comment at the bottom read, "Please stick to the assigned material in the future." The morning everything changed started like any other, except it didn't. Marcus sat at his kitchen table at 6 a.m., trying to finish his homework while his mother coughed violently in the next room. She'd been sick for days but couldn't afford to miss work. "Mom, you need to see a doctor," Marcus pleaded, bringing her some water. "Can't miss another shift, baby. We need the money." She tried to stand but swayed dangerously. Marcus made a decision. "You're not going to work today. I'm calling your supervisor." After helping his mother back to bed and calling both her workplace and a free clinic to make an appointment, Marcus realized he was already late for school. He ran the entire way, his worn shoes slapping against the pavement, arriving at Riverside Academy just as first period was ending. Ms. Bennett was writing on the board when Marcus slipped into the classroom, his clothes disheveled from running, his breath still coming in gasps. Well, she announced to the class, "How kind of you to finally join us, Mr. Johnson. I suppose punctuality isn't a priority in your household." Marcus started to explain about his mother, but Ms. Bennett cut him off. "Your appearance is even more unacceptable than usual today. Those clothes look like they came from a dumpster." Several students shifted uncomfortably. They'd never heard Ms. Bennett be quite so openly cruel. Marcus looked down at his shirt. In his rush to help his mother, he put on one that had a small tear near the collar. His face burned with shame, but he held his head high. "I apologize for being late, Ms. Bennett. My mother is sick, and I had to." "Excuses," she interrupted. "Always excuses. This is exactly the kind of behavior that doesn't belong at Riverside Academy. Stand up, Mr. Johnson. Let everyone see what happens when we lower our standards." Marcus stood slowly, his hands trembling slightly but his voice steady. "My mother works 3 jobs to keep me in this school, Ms. Bennett. She pressed this shirt at midnight after her shift. The tear happened when I was helping her to bed this morning because she's too sick to stand. If that's below your standards, then maybe your standards aren't as high as you think they are." The classroom was dead silent. Even the usual hallway noise seemed to have faded away. Ms. Bennett's face went through several shades of red. "How dare you? Go to the principal's office immediately." "Ms. Bennett," Sarah interjected, "that's not fair. Marcus didn't do anything wrong." "Quiet." Ms. Bennett snapped. "Unless you want to join him." Marcus gathered his books with deliberate calm, though inside his heart was racing. As he reached the door, Ms. Bennett's voice stopped him. "And Mr. Johnson, don't bother coming back to my class until you learn some respect. Some people simply don't belong here, no matter how many equations they can solve." The words hung in the air like poison. Marcus stepped into the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Halfway to the principal's office, he ducked into a bathroom, finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. He thought about his mother, probably still feverish in her bed. About his father, who had taught him that dignity wasn't about what you wore but how you carried yourself. About all the late nights his mother spent working, all the sacrifices she made, all the hours his father had spent teaching him before he passed away. A knock on the bathroom door startled him. "Marcus?" It was James, from his class. "We all think what Ms. Bennett did was wrong. Sarah's already called her parents, and they're on the school board." Marcus wiped his eyes quickly. "Thanks, but I need to handle this my way." "The principal should know how she treats you," James insisted. "It's not right." Marcus emerged from the bathroom, his composure regained. "Some people only learn when they're forced to face their own prejudices," he said, remembering something his father once told him. "Sometimes you have to be so good they can't ignore you." He walked to the principal's office, each step purposeful. Ms. Bennett wanted a confrontation. Fine. But it wouldn't end the way she expected. His mother had sacrificed too much, his father had taught him too well, for him to let anyone make him feel less than who he was. As he approached Principal Green's office, he saw Ms. Bennett already there, speaking animatedly through the glass door. She had beaten him there, no doubt telling her version of events. But Marcus wasn't worried. Truth, like mathematics, had a way of revealing itself when all the elements were properly examined. He straightened his torn collar, took a deep breath, and knocked on the principal's door. Whatever came next, he would face it with the dignity his parents had taught him and the knowledge they had sacrificed to give him. Ms. Bennet might see his torn shirt, but soon she would have to see something else, a student whose intelligence and character far outweighed any superficial judgments she could make. Even as Marcus waited outside Principal Green's office, life at Riverside Academy continued its normal rhythm. The annual science fair was approaching, an event that Ms. Bennet had been put in charge of organizing. Despite their ongoing conflict, Marcus had spent weeks preparing his project, a complex mathematical model predicting climate change impacts on local ecosystems. The morning of the science fair arrived just 2 days after the classroom confrontation. Marcus had stayed up late finalizing his presentation, his mother insisting on helping despite her lingering illness. "Your father would have loved this," she said, watching him arrange his display. "He always said mathematics could help us understand everything, from stars to raindrops." The school gymnasium buzzed with activity as students set up their projects. Ms. Bennet walked between the tables, clipboard in hand, her face neutral until she reached Marcus's station. Her eyes narrowed at his display, which included complex differential equations and computer-generated models. "Mr. Johnson," she said coldly, "I hope you're not planning to present something beyond your understanding. Where did you get these equations?" "I derived them myself, Ms. Bennet," Marcus replied quietly. "They're based on standard climate models, but I modified them to account for local variables." She scribbled something on her clipboard. "We'll see about that during the judging." Throughout the morning, other teachers visited the projects, clearly impressed by Marcus's work. Dr. Rodriguez, the chemistry teacher, spent 20 minutes discussing the mathematical principles with him. "This is graduate-level work, Marcus," he said, loud enough for nearby students to hear. "Have you considered publishing your findings?" Ms. Bennet, who was passing by, interjected, "Surely you don't believe a 13-year-old developed this independently, Dr. Rodriguez? It's obviously copied from somewhere." The chemistry teacher frowned. "I've worked with Marcus in my class, Catherine. He's more than capable of this level of work." "We'll need to verify his sources," Ms. Bennet insisted. "We can't have students claiming credit for others' work." Marcus felt his face burn but kept his composure. "Every equation is cited, Ms. Bennet. When I built on others' work, I referenced them. The new developments are my own." Other students began gathering around his display, attracted by the confrontation. Sarah, who had stood up for him in class, spoke up. "Ms. Bennet, I watched Marcus work on this during lunch breaks. He explained everything to anyone who asked. He didn't copy anything." Ms. Bennet's face tightened. "Well, we'll let the judges decide. Though I must say, it's remarkable how much time one can devote to extra projects when they don't bother with proper attendance or dress code." The reference to Marcus's late arrival and torn shirt from earlier that week hung in the air. But before anyone could respond, Principal Green walked into the gymnasium. He moved slowly between the projects, eventually reaching Marcus's display. "Interesting work, Mr. Johnson," he said, studying the equations. "Would you mind explaining your methodology?" For the next 15 minutes, Marcus walked through his research, explaining how he'd combined various mathematical models to create a more accurate local prediction system. Principal Green asked several pointed questions, which Marcus answered with confidence and clarity. "Very impressive," the principal said finally. "Ms. Bennet, I believe this project deserves serious consideration for the top prize." Ms. Bennet's smile was brittle. "With all due respect, sir, we need to verify the originality of the work. It seems unlikely that a student with his background could produce this level of mathematics." The principal's expression didn't change, but his voice carried a note of steel. "His background, Ms. Bennet? Would you care to elaborate on what you mean by that?" The tension in the air was palpable. Other teachers had gathered nearby, watching the exchange with concern. Ms. Bennet seemed to realize she'd crossed a line. "I simply mean, given his late enrollment and different educational history." "Different?" Principal Green raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Johnson's previous school records show consistent excellence in mathematics and sciences. Perhaps we should discuss your concerns about his background in my office?" Before Ms. Bennet could respond, the judges announced it was time to make their decisions. The crowd around Marcus's display dispersed, but the incident had left its mark. Students whispered among themselves, and other teachers watched Ms. Bennet with new awareness. When the results were announced that afternoon, Marcus's project had won first place. The judges specifically praised his innovative approach and thorough documentation. As he accepted the award, he caught sight of Ms. Bennet's face, a mixture of anger, disbelief, and something else. Perhaps, finally, a crack in her certainty about who Marcus was and what he could achieve. The morning after the science fair, Marcus arrived at school to find a note in his locker requesting his immediate presence in Principal Green's office. His heart sank, knowing what was coming. The confrontation that had been building for weeks was finally reaching its climax. As he approached the office, he saw Ms. Bennet already inside, her posture rigid as she sat across from Principal Green. Through the glass, he could see her gesturing emphatically, occasionally pointing to a file on the principal's desk. The secretary nodded for Marcus to enter. As he stepped inside, Ms. Bennet's voice became clear, pattern of disruptive behavior, challenging authority, and now this questionable science fair project. I believe we need to reconsider his placement at Riverside Academy. Principal Green looked up as Marcus entered. "Ah, Mr. Johnson. Please, have a seat. Ms. Bennet has some concerns she'd like to discuss." Marcus sat quietly, his father's words echoing in his memory, "Let them speak first, son. Knowledge isn't just about having the right answers, it's about knowing when to listen." Ms. Bennet straightened her papers, her voice clipped and professional. "Mr. Johnson has consistently undermined my authority in class, arrives late, fails to maintain appropriate standards of dress, and produces work of questionable origin. Yesterday's science fair project, for instance, used mathematics far beyond what a student his age could possibly understand." "I see," Principal Green said carefully. "Marcus, would you like to respond to these allegations?" Marcus took a deep breath. "I arrived late once, sir, because my mother was ill and needed medical help. As for my clothes..." He paused, fighting back emotion. "We do our best with what we have. My mother works 3 jobs to keep me here." "That's not the issue," Ms. Bennet interrupted. "The issue is your persistent attitude and this impossible level of mathematical knowledge. No student from your background could have developed these skills without some form of deception." Principal Green's expression hardened. "Ms. Bennet, I'd like you to be very specific about what you mean by background." The room fell silent. Ms. Bennet seemed to realize she'd overstepped again, but she pressed on. "I simply mean that given his previous schooling and obvious economic situation, this level of achievement is highly suspicious." Marcus felt a calm clarity settle over him. "My father was a mathematician, Ms. Bennet. Self-taught, but brilliant. He worked as a janitor at the university because that's the only job he could get, but he spent every free moment learning and teaching me. Before he died 2 years ago, he made sure I understood not just the equations, but why they mattered." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a worn notebook. This was his. Every night, he would write down problems for me to solve, concepts to explore. When he got sick, he filled it with everything he wanted to teach me but worried he wouldn't have time to explain. Marcus placed the notebook on Principal Green's desk. The pages were filled with complex equations, careful explanations, and notes in 2 different handwritings, a father and son sharing the language of mathematics. "I can solve your equations because my father taught me that mathematics doesn't care what you wear or where you live. It only cares if you understand it. And I do understand it, Ms. Bennet. Every equation, every proof, every concept you've presented. I understand them because a man who cleaned floors for a living made sure his son would never be limited by other people's expectations." Principal Green picked up the notebook, examining the pages with interest. Ms. Bennet sat in stunned silence, her carefully constructed complaints crumbling in the face of Marcus's quiet dignity. "Ms. Bennet," Principal Green said finally, "I believe we need to discuss your assumptions about students' capabilities and backgrounds. But first..." He turned to Marcus. Would you be willing to demonstrate your mathematical knowledge? Perhaps solve a problem of Ms. Bennet's choosing? Marcus nodded, thinking of his father's words, "When they doubt you, son, let the numbers speak for themselves." Ms. Bennet's face showed a mix of emotions, anger, uncertainty, and perhaps a tiny flicker of shame. She reached for a piece of paper, her hand trembling slightly as she prepared to write what she clearly intended to be an impossible problem. The equation she was about to present would be her last attempt to prove her prejudices right. But as Marcus watched her write, he felt no fear, only a deep sadness for someone who had allowed her biases to blind her to the simple truth his father had taught him, that brilliance knows no color, and genius wears no particular clothes. The silence in Principal Green's office was broken only by the scratch of Ms. Bennet's pen against paper. She was writing with fierce concentration, occasionally pausing to reference an advanced mathematics textbook she'd brought with her. After several minutes, she straightened up, a gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. "This," she announced, sliding the paper across the desk, "is a problem from advanced theoretical mathematics. It combines multiple concepts and requires a sophisticated understanding of several mathematical principles. If Mr. Johnson can solve this independently, without any assistance." She left the sentence hanging. Principal Green studied the equation, his eyebrows rising. "This seems rather advanced, Ms. Bennet. Are you certain this is appropriate? If Mr. Johnson is as brilliant as everyone seems to believe, he should have no trouble with it," she replied, her voice carrying a note of triumph. Marcus pulled the paper closer. The equation sprawled across the page, a complex combination of differential calculus, number theory, and abstract algebra. It was the kind of problem that would challenge graduate students, exactly the sort of thing his father had loved to explore. As he read through it, a memory surfaced, his father sitting at their kitchen table late at night, explaining a similar concept. "Mathematics is like a puzzle, son. Break it down piece by piece, and even the most complicated problem becomes manageable." Marcus picked up a pencil and began to write. The room fell silent except for the soft sound of his pencil moving across paper. Ms. Bennet watched intently, her expression shifting from satisfaction to confusion as Marcus worked steadily through the problem. He started by breaking down the equation into its component parts, just as his father had taught him. Each step was carefully documented, each transformation explained. When he encountered a particularly tricky section, he paused, closing his eyes briefly to visualize the solution. 20 minutes passed. Principal Green had pulled out his phone at one point to look up some of the mathematical concepts involved, his expression growing increasingly impressed. Ms. Bennet had stopped smirking and was now leaning forward, following Marcus's work with growing disbelief. Finally, Marcus set down his pencil. He had filled 3 pages with calculations, each step leading logically to the next, culminating in a solution that was elegant in its simplicity. "I believe this is the answer," he said quietly, pushing the papers toward Principal Green. "I've shown all my work and included explanations for each step." Principal Green passed the papers to Ms. Bennet, who snatched them up eagerly, clearly expecting to find mistakes. Her eyes moved rapidly over the pages, her frown deepening with each line. This is impossible," she muttered. "You couldn't have." She pulled out her textbook again, flipping pages frantically. "Is there a problem with my solution, Ms. Bennet?" Marcus asked politely. She looked up, her face flushed. "How did you know to use this particular transformation in step 4? This is advanced graduate-level mathematics." Marcus reached for his father's notebook, flipping to a page near the middle. "My father and I worked on something similar last year, before he passed away. He showed me how these types of equations can be simplified by recognizing certain patterns." Principal Green cleared his throat. "Ms. Bennet, would you say Mr. Johnson's solution is correct?" She stared at the papers for a long moment before answering, her voice barely audible. "Yes. The solution is perfect. Every step is clearly explained, and the final answer is correct." She looked up at Marcus, really seeing him perhaps for the first time. "How is this possible?" Because my father believed I could learn anything if I worked hard enough, Marcus replied simply. He didn't see limits, he only saw possibilities. The atmosphere in Principal Green's office had shifted dramatically. The tension that had filled the room earlier was replaced by a heavy silence as Ms. Bennet continued to stare at Marcus's solution, her worldview visibly crumbling. Principal Green was the first to speak. Ms. Bennet, I believe we need to address the real issue here, and it isn't Mr. Johnson's mathematical abilities. She looked up, her face pale. I don't understand how. That's precisely the problem, Principal Green said firmly. You made assumptions about Marcus's capabilities based on factors that have nothing to do with his intelligence or ability to learn. Your behavior has been inappropriate and, frankly, discriminatory. Ms. Bennet flinched at the word discriminatory, but Principal Green continued. Your comments about his background, your attempts to humiliate him in class, your baseless accusations about his science fair project, all of these reflect prejudices that have no place in education. I was only trying to maintain standards, she protested weakly. Standards? Marcus spoke up, his voice gentle. Ms. Bennet, my father taught me that real standards aren't about where you come from or what you wear. They're about what you know and how you treat others. He opened his father's notebook again, turning to the last page. This was the final note my father wrote to me before he died. Would you like to read it? After a moment's hesitation, Ms. Bennet took the notebook. Her hands trembled slightly as she read, My dear son, remember that knowledge is a light that shines equally on all who seek it. Some will try to dim your light because they don't understand how brightly you can shine. Don't let them. Your mind is a gift, use it not to prove others wrong, but to prove what's possible. With endless love and pride, Dad. Ms. Bennet's hands dropped to her lap, still holding the notebook. For the first time since Marcus had known her, she seemed at a loss for words. Principal Green spoke into the silence. Ms. Bennet, I expect you to make significant changes in how you interact with all students. We'll be having several discussions about this in the coming weeks. For now, I believe you owe Marcus an apology. She looked up at Marcus, tears visible in her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. I was so wrong. About everything. Marcus nodded, accepting her apology with the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout their confrontations. My father also taught me that everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow. Even teachers. Principal Green smiled slightly. Marcus, you may return to class. Ms. Bennet and I need to discuss some changes to ensure this situation never happens again at Riverside Academy. As Marcus stood to leave, Ms. Bennet spoke again. Your father, he sounds like he was an extraordinary teacher. He was, Marcus replied, picking up his backpack. He taught me that mathematics is beautiful because it doesn't discriminate. In math, there's only right and wrong, truth and error. Everything else, all the prejudices and preconceptions, that's just human confusion that gets in the way of seeing the real answers. He paused at the door. And Ms. Bennet? He would have been happy to share what he knew with you too. That's what real teachers do. As Marcus walked down the hallway, he felt lighter somehow. His father's notebook was back in his backpack, but its lessons were alive in the world in a new way. Something had changed, not just for him and Ms. Bennet, but for Riverside Academy itself. Behind him, he could hear Principal Green beginning a serious conversation about institutional changes and unconscious bias training. But Marcus was already thinking about tomorrow's mathematics problems, and all the beautiful equations waiting to be solved. The next few weeks at Riverside Academy brought changes that rippled through the entire school community. Ms. Bennet's classroom demeanor underwent a remarkable transformation, though the adjustment wasn't always smooth. One morning, about 2 weeks after the confrontation in Principal Green's office, Marcus arrived at class to find Ms. Bennet standing uncertainly at the front of the room. Her usual confident pose was replaced by something more thoughtful, more aware. Today, she announced, her voice carrying a new note of humility, we're going to discuss the contributions of mathematicians from various cultures and backgrounds. And She paused, glancing at Marcus. I would appreciate Mr. Johnson's input, given his extensive knowledge in this area. The class shifted in surprise. Sarah, sitting next to Marcus, gave him an encouraging smile. Perhaps, Ms. Bennet continued, you could tell us more about some of the mathematicians your father taught you about. Marcus stood slowly, aware of the significance of this moment. My father always said that mathematics is a universal language. He taught me about Benjamin Banneker, a self-taught African-American mathematician who helped survey Washington, D.C. And about Dorothy Johnson Vaughan, who was essential to NASA's early space programs. As Marcus spoke, Ms. Bennet began taking notes, on what he was saying. The sight was so unexpected that several students exchanged startled glances. He also taught me about current mathematicians like Dr. Katherine Johnson, who calculated trajectories for NASA missions. She faced discrimination but never let it stop her from doing extraordinary work. Ms. Bennet nodded thoughtfully. I must admit I wasn't familiar with some of these names. Would you be willing to help me develop a more inclusive curriculum? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. This wasn't just about mathematics anymore, it was about acknowledging blind spots and being willing to learn from those we once dismissed. After class, Ms. Bennet asked Marcus to stay behind. But this time, her tone was different. I've been doing a lot of thinking, she said, sitting down at a student desk rather than standing over him. Your father's notebook, would you tell me more about him? Marcus pulled out the worn notebook, handling it with care. He worked as a janitor at the university, but he spent every lunch break in the mathematics library. The professors started noticing him solving complex equations on his breaks. One of them, Dr. Rodriguez, no relation to our chemistry teacher, began sharing books with him. Ms. Bennet listened intently as Marcus described how his father would study late into the night, teaching himself concepts that many struggled to grasp even with formal education. He always said that where you start doesn't determine where you can go, Marcus continued. He believed that talent and passion for learning can come from anywhere. He was right, Ms. Bennet said softly. I was so wrong, Marcus. I let my preconceptions blind me to what was right in front of me. A brilliant student who could have taught me as much as I could teach him. She reached into her desk and pulled out a book. I found this last weekend. It's about mathematicians from diverse backgrounds throughout history. I thought, maybe we could both learn from it. Marcus took the book, noting the fresh highlighter marks and sticky notes already decorating its pages. Ms. Bennet had been doing her homework. There's something else, she added, her voice hesitant. Principal Green mentioned your mother has been ill. I know a doctor who runs a free clinic. If you'd like, I could help arrange an appointment. The offer hung in the air, not just an attempt at making amends, but a genuine step toward understanding the challenges some of her students faced. Thank you, Marcus replied. That would help a lot. As he left the classroom, he heard Ms. Bennet on the phone, already making the arrangements. Something his father used to say came back to him, real change happens when people stop seeing differences as barriers and start seeing them as bridges to understanding. The end of the semester brought more than just final exams to Riverside Academy. The school had undergone a transformation that went far beyond new policies and diversity training sessions. It was a change in culture, sparked by one student's quiet dignity in the face of prejudice. Ms. Bennet's classroom had become a model of inclusive education. The walls, once decorated solely with portraits of European mathematicians, now showcased a diverse array of scientific pioneers. More importantly, her teaching style had evolved to encourage questions and alternative perspectives. On the last day of the semester, she organized a special presentation. Students from all grades were invited to share mathematical concepts from their own cultural backgrounds. Marcus presented a segment on African fractal patterns and their application in modern computing. Principal Green, watching from the back of the room, smiled as he saw Ms. Bennet actively engaging with each presentation, asking questions, and taking notes. The transformation in her was remarkable, from a teacher who once saw differences as deficits to one who celebrated diversity of thought and experience. During lunch break, Marcus sat with his mother in the school cafeteria. Thanks to Ms. Bennett's connection at the free clinic, she had received proper medical care and was finally recovering. She had been invited to speak to the Parent-Teacher Association about creating a support network for working parents. "Your father would be so proud," she said, watching students from all backgrounds mingling freely at the surrounding tables. "Not just of your achievements, but of how you handled everything with grace." Marcus nodded, thinking of his father's notebook, which now sat in a special display case in the school library. Ms. Bennett had suggested creating an exhibit about self-taught mathematicians, with his father's story as a centerpiece. The afternoon brought one final surprise. Ms. Bennett called Marcus to her classroom after the last bell. "I have something for you," she said, handing him an envelope. Inside was an application for a prestigious summer mathematics program at the local university. "I've already spoken with the directors," she explained. "They're very interested in having you, and there's a full scholarship available. Your father's friend, Dr. Rodriguez from the university library, actually serves on the selection committee. He remembered your father and was deeply moved by your story." Marcus stared at the application, emotion welling up in his throat. "But that's not all," Ms. Bennett continued. "We're starting a new mentorship program next year, pairing experienced students with those who might need extra support. I was hoping you would consider being our first mentor." "Me?" Marcus looked up in surprise. "Who better?" she smiled. "You've taught us all something important about judgment, perseverance, and the power of knowledge. Some lessons can't be found in textbooks." As Marcus walked home that afternoon, he reflected on the journey of the past few months. His father's words echoed in his mind: "Knowledge is a light that shines equally on all who seek it." The setting sun cast long shadows across Riverside Academy's campus, but the building seemed different now, more welcoming, more alive with possibility. A group of students passed by, including some faces he didn't recognize. They were carrying math textbooks and chatting excitedly about an upcoming project. "Hey, Marcus," one called out. "We're having trouble with some equations. Would you mind helping us out tomorrow during lunch?" "Of course," he smiled. "My father always said that knowledge grows when it's shared." As he turned toward home, Marcus caught sight of Ms. Bennett leaving the school. She was carrying a stack of books, more diverse mathematical histories, he guessed. She waved to him, and he waved back, remembering another of his father's favorite sayings: "The greatest victory isn't proving others wrong, it's helping them see what's right." The story of the rude teacher and the impossible problem would be told at Riverside Academy for years to come. But it wouldn't be remembered as a tale of conflict and prejudice. Instead, it would be known as a story of transformation, proof that when we open our minds to possibility, we open doors for everyone. Marcus pulled his father's old notebook from his backpack, thumbing through the worn pages one more time before heading home. Tomorrow would bring new equations to solve, new minds to enlighten, and new bridges to build. After all, that's what his father had taught him mathematics was really about, not just solving problems, but bringing people together through the universal language of numbers. And somewhere, he knew, his father was smiling. True brilliance knows no color, class, or creed. Every day, countless talented minds face barriers built from prejudice and preconception. But talent, like truth, has a way of shining through even the darkest doubts. Let this story remind us that genius can come from anywhere, and that our greatest duty is to nurture it wherever we find it. Together, we can build a world where every child's potential is recognized, regardless of their background or circumstances. Every mind deserves the chance to shine. If this story touched your heart and made you think differently about talent and opportunity, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Help us spread more stories that challenge prejudices and inspire change.